CBS News contributor Bob Schieffer covered George Bush's presidential campaigns in 1980 and 1988. The longtime moderator of Face the Nation is here with USA Today Washington bureau chief Susan Page, who also covered the Bush campaigns. Her upcoming book is called The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty. Looking forward to that book. Bob, you think about the 11 presidencies you've covered, is that right? And I know that you have said that President George H.W. Bush was one of the most modest presidents ever, if not the most.
Well, he was. I mean, when you stop and think about it, I mean, he didn't even feel it was appropriate to write a book at the end of his presidency. How many presidents in modern times can you remember that took that point of view? And he just, it was part of his upbringing. His family, his mother had beaten into those children that, look, we don't brag on things we do, which is why I've always thought he was a much better public servant than he was a politician. He just never was comfortable, you know, promoting himself.
One of his other attributes was these handwritten notes, which I had heard about, that he would keep a stack of them, even in the presidential limo, that he was always writing notes. And you received one of his notes, Susan. What was it about?
Well, in 1990, White House press conference, he called on me, he pointed at me and said, "Ann, do you have a question?" And of course, my name wasn't Ann, and Devroy's name was Ann, and Devroy was the Washington Post reporter, was a couple seats away. But he was clearly calling me, so I asked a question. And then he worked my name into his response. So, Ann, I blah, 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 and Ann this. And so there was this laughter that was rising up with my colleagues because he kept calling me Ann. And so when he left the press conference, he said to Marlin Fitzwater, his press secretary, "Why were they laughing?" And he said, "Her name's not Ann, her name's Susan." And then he wrote the next day, this beautiful note arrived, this handwritten note from President Bush saying, "I know you're not Ann. Ann Margaret lives on the West Coast, but I forgot." So classic George Bush, and it was very, no need, I took no offense, no need for him to write it. He does this corny joke about Ann Margaret. And so, of course, I had this framed and hanging on my wall at home.
Of course, yeah.
Bob, this humility that you're talking about, you know, when he used to talk about his failures, he would say I. When he talked about the success of administration, he used to say we. The reason this is important is because it helps in a White House, right? When you create this sense of team and people around you feel like you're all together.
Well, exactly. And you know, he was so restrained. I mean, to me, the great mark of his presidency was the restraint he exercised at very crucial junctures of American history. When the Berlin Wall fell, for example, he refused to brag about it. He refused to let anybody else brag about it. And I talked to his son, George W. Bush, one time about that, and I said, "Why was he that way?" And he said he had this tremendous ability to put himself in the other guy's shoes. And he knew he was going to need Gorbachev's cooperation when communism collapsed. And that's why he exercised that restraint. He did the same thing in the Tiananmen Square situation. He didn't say anything in the beginning, but then a couple of months later, he sent Brent Scowcroft to Beijing, and he laid down the law. He said, "Look, we can't get along with you if this is how it's going to be."
I think one of the things people may not know about him, although we've mentioned it and certainly did again on 60 Minutes, but here he is, 18 years old, and enlists in the Navy. His father, the Senator Prescott Bush, does not. He wants him to go to Yale, and instead he flies combat missions, is almost killed. He had this sense. He said it was the only time he saw his father cry when he went off to war. That sense of duty, honor. He was our last president who served in combat.
No question about his determination to enlist. He considered, in fact, enlisting in the Canadian Air Force because they would take you at 17 instead of 18. He waited until he graduated from prep school, took the train with his father down to New York, enlisted. He was always sensitive. Barbara Bush told me he was sensitive about the fact that he was so young. He was either the youngest or one of the youngest Navy pilots ever. And that when she came to visit him once when he was being trained, that he wanted her to lie about her age to add a year so that his colleagues would not think he was such a kid.
And you know, Norah, when we talk about his combat, we talk about when he was shot down over the Pacific. But the fact is he flew 58 combat missions under fire. Right. And again, he never talked about it very much. He didn't like to because he always remembered his two crew members who died when the plane was shot down. And that was the part that he always
taking off
about.
and landing on aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
That's why the idea that they always challenged his manliness. The guy who flew that many missions, got shot down and jumped out of a plane. He was doing fine.
Yeah.
Bob Schieffer, Susan Page, thank you. Not to be confused with Ann.